Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 103. With our book today, a short novel, a relatively short novel anyway, that focuses on a topic area relevant for understanding and communication efforts and leadership efforts, quite frankly, in our own current time. First published in 1862, this book tells the story about the clash of ideologies between generations. Remember, I said it was relevant to our time. The core of this story focuses on the inability, or at least the challenges, that parents and children have in communicating across the narrow expanse of time when great social and cultural unraveling is coalescing around them at exactly the same time. A lot of what we have talked about this year on the podcast has been focused around this idea of America exiting the fourth turning, exiting chaos. Well, before you can get into chaos, you have to have an unraveling. And our unraveling happened between the 1980s and actually the 1970s in America and the 1990s, except we all didn't recognize it. Because after an unraveling, there is chaos. And when this book was written during a time of unraveling, which was followed closely by a time of chaos. And we're going to talk about all of that today. Well, in our time, as we begin to exit the chaos that always follows such an unraveling, as I just said, American society and American leadership is beginning, with fits, starts, and stops, to put back together the pieces of communication between people, leveraging the long tail of technology and the technology of the internet and the narrow casting of podcasts and long-form video, kind of like the video you're watching today or the podcast episode you are listening to today. This process of putting everything back together is indeed a long process. It will not happen instantly at the snap of our fingers, and this book guides us through understanding just how long and tenuous a process that will be. Today, we will be covering the relationship between fathers and sons, or in the original Russian, fathers and children, by Ivan Turgenev. And today, in order to kind of walk through this, we will be rejoined by our co-host. And pardon me if you hear me doing all that. I'm struggling a little bit with allergies. I'm going to try to mute as much of that out of this episode as I possibly can. But we will be rejoined by our co-host today, Libby Unger. How you doing, Libby?
I'm great. Nice to be here again.
All right. Going to be a little bit more toned down from last time you were here, maybe.
Maybe. I have a little more sleep under the belt.
Yeah, you were just jet lagged coming back from India. Yeah. So this will be I think this will be a good conversation today. So let me pick up from Fathers and Sons. I'm going to pick up from chapter 1 of this book by Ivan Turgenev. Well, Pietro, not in sight yet, was the question asked on May the 20th, 1859, by a gentleman of a little over 40 in a dusty coat and checked trousers, who came in without his hat to the low steps of the posting station at S. He was addressing his servant, a chubby young fellow
with whitish down on his chin and little lackluster eyes. The servant, in whom everything, the turquoise ring in his ear, the streaky hair plastered with grease, and the civility of his movements, indicated a man of the new, improved generation, glanced with an air of indulgence along the road and made an answer. "No, sir, not in sight." "Not in sight," repeated his master. "No, sir," responded the man a second time. The master sighed and sat down on a little bench. We will introduce him to the reader while he sits, his feet tucked under him, gazing thoughtfully round. His name was Nikolai Petrovich Kirsanov. He had 12 miles from the posting station a fine property of 200 souls, or as he expressed it, since he had arranged the division of his land with the peasants and started a quote-unquote farm of nearly 5,000 acres. His father, a general in the army who served in 1812, a coarse, half-educated, but not ill-natured man, a typical Russian, who had been in harness all his life, first in command of a brigade, then of a division, and lived constantly in the provinces where, by virtue of his rank, he played a fairly important part. Nikolai Petrovich was born in the south of Russia like his elder brother Pavel, of whom more hereafter. He was educated at home till he was 14, surrounded by cheap tutors, free and easy but toadying adjuncts, and all the usual regimental and staff set. His mother, one of the Kolyazayan family, as a girl called Agatha, but as general's wife, Agolathea Kuzminisha Kirsanov, was one of those military ladies who take their full share of the duties and dignities of office. She wore gorgeous caps and rustling silk dresses. In church, she was the first to advance to the cross. She talked a great deal in a loud voice, let her children kiss her hand in the morning, and gave them her blessing at night. In fact, she got everything out of life she could. Nikolai Petrovich, as a general's son, though so far from being distinguished by courage that he even deserved to be called a funk, was intended, like his brother Pavel, to enter the army, but he broke his leg on the very day when the news of his commission came, and after being 2 months in bed, retained a slight limp to the end of his days. His father gave him up as a bad job and let him go into the civil service. He took him to Petersburg directly. He was 18 and placed him in the university. His brother happened about the same time to be made an officer in the guards. The young men started living together in one set of rooms under the remote supervision of a cousin on their mother's side, Ilya Kolyazin, an official of high rank. Their father returned to his division and his wife, and only rarely sent his sons large sheets of gray paper, scrawled over in a bold, clerkly hand. At the bottom of these sheets stood in letters, enclosed carefully in scroll work, the words Pyotr Kirsanov, General Major. In 1835, Nikolai Petrovich left the university a graduate. In the same year, General Kirsanov was put on the retired list after an unsuccessful review and came to Petersburg with his wife to live. He was about to take a house in the Tavarishki Gardens and join the English Club, but he died suddenly of an apoplectic fit. Agolathea Kumnishka soon followed him. She could not accustom herself to a dull life in the capital. She was consumed by the ennui of existence away from the regiment. Meanwhile, Nikolai Petrovich had already, in his parents' lifetime, and to their no slight chagrin, had time to fall in love with the daughter of his landlord, a petty official, Prepolinevensky. She was pretty and, as is called, advanced girl. She used to read serious articles in the science column of the journals. He married her directly. The term of mourning was over, and leaving the civil service in which his father had, by favor, procured him a post, was perfectly blissful with his Masha. First in a country villa near the Liensky Institute, afterwards in a town, a pretty little flat with a clean staircase and a haughty drawing room, and then in the country, where he settled finally, and where, in a short time, son Arkady was born to him. The young couple lived very happily and peacefully and were scarcely ever apart. They read together, sang and played duets on the piano. She tended her flowers and looked after the poultry yard. He sometimes went hunting and busied himself with the estate, while Arkady grew and grew in the same happy and peaceful way. 10 years passed like a dream. In 1847, Kirsanov's wife died. He almost succumbed to this blow. In a few weeks, his hair was gray. He was getting ready to go abroad, if possible, to distract his mind, but then came the year 1848. He returned unwillingly to the country and, after a rather prolonged period of inactivity, began to take interest in the improvements of the management of his land. In 1855, he brought his son to the university. He spent 3 winters with him in Petersburg, hardly going out anywhere, and trying to make acquaintance with Arkady's young companions. The last winter he had not been able to go, and here we have seen him in May of 1859, already quite gray, stoutish, and rather bent, waiting for his son, who had just taken his degree, as once he had taken it himself. Why did I give you all of that background? Well, because A, this is what Russian writers do. They give you the background of everybody in the family before they tell you anything that's going to happen before they move on to the main action. And Turgenev is, at the end of the day, or was at the end of the day, a Russian writer. Speaking of which, the literary life of Ivan Turgenev is probably worthwhile for us to understand, even after that whole laying out of the history of Nikolai and Arkady. Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev was born on November 9th, 1818, and died September 3rd, 1883. He was a Russian novelist, a short story writer, a poet, a playwright, a translator, and a popularizer of Russian literature to and in the West. Ivan and his brothers, Nikolai and Sergei, were raised by their mother, an educated and authoritarian woman. Their father spent little time with the family, and although he was not hostile to them, his absence hurt Ivan's feelings. After the standard schooling for the son of a gentleman, Turgenev studied for 1 year at the University of Moscow and then moved on to the University of St. Petersburg. From 1838 to 1841, he studied philosophy, particularly Hegel. This is, by the way, very important to understand for what's about to happen in Fathers and Sons. And he studied history at the University of Berlin. Now, what we don't realize now, because a lot of things have happened, is that back in the day, Germany was considered to be the high cultural and intellectual glittering jewel of Europe. And everyone from Russia who wanted to learn anything about anything intellectual or cultural went to Germany. And I know that's kind of weird, but particularly with the rise of Hegel and Hegelianism, and then later on with the rise of Nietzsche and Nietzschean ideas of nihilism, Germany became a hotbed of intellectual and cultural desire for the Russians. By the way, historically, that's probably not going to work out for them later. Turgenev first made his name with writing A Sportsman's Sketches, a collection of short stories credited with having influenced Russian public opinion in favor of the abolition of serfdom in 1861. And this is another element that we forget about in Russia. Russia had a system of serfdom. When we think about serfdom, we should probably think about it in context of American slavery, which was also not beginning to be abolished. It had yet to be abolished, but was on the road to being abolished in 1861. We were having a civil war over it. Russians, however, were just having it thrust upon them. Fathers and Sons, Turgenev's most famous and enduring novel, appeared in 1862. Its leading character, who we have not met yet, Eugene Bazarov, was considered the first Bolshevik in Russian literature, and was in turn heralded and reviled as either a glorification or a parody of the quote-unquote new men of the 1860s. Unlike Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, who Turgenev did know, by the way, as a matter of fact, it was Tolstoy who spoke at his funeral, and Turgenev had a little contretemps with Dostoevsky that went on 10 years, if you can believe that. Literary fights are some of the worst literary fights. But Turgenev lacked religious motives in his writings. That's something that you see in Fathers and Sons. He's not consumed with religion in the same way that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are. And he was more consumed with the social aspects of the reform movements that were beginning to sweep and unravel Russia in the 1860s and subsequently 1870s and 1880s, and all that unraveling that would lead to the horror of World War I, and then the Leninist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution on the other side of that. Turgenev was considered to be an agnostic, and he did not let religion influence his writings. unlike Dostoevsky, who considered himself a Christian socialist, and Tolstoy, who considered himself a man of God, period. So that's where we are starting with Turgenev, with Fathers and Sons, with Russian history. There's a lot here that parallels ways in which America has engaged with itself internally between the 1990s and all the way up to now, right? The last 30 years. Of course, there are ways in which those parallels don't line up. There's ways in which we have parted because we have our own separate history with our own separate set of ideas. But there are broad lessons that can be drawn for leaders from Turgenev's Fathers and Sons and from the literary life of Ivan Turgenev. And so I'm going to kick this over to Libby now. I sent you a link to a video about Turgenev, watched a little bit of that. I don't know if you watched that. But to tell me what you know about Turgenev, tell me about the literary life of Ivan Turgenev, and what do you think of Fathers and Sons? Let's start there.
Yeah, you did an excellent job of recapping kind of the literary journey and the comparison with other famous Russian authors. I read this in high school, and I remember loving it. But I loved all of the Russian literature. I think it has to do with the deep exploration of the human condition, the human condition, and understanding how we all have dark and light in us. We all have good and evil. It's about understanding it and not letting letting the dark outweigh the light. But if you understand the human condition in yourself, first you can solve for it, and then if you see it in others too, you can help them see it and act, or input systems in place so they act in their delighted and heart-based best interest. But I just always love the descriptions in the Russian language. What was interesting is I would never have guessed that Dostoevsky had a religious foundation. Like when having read Crime and Punishment, that was not a thoroughfare in that book, or at least for me. It was understanding the human condition, though. In the same way, I think that the Bible is from all the allegories within the Bible. They're just ways for you to understand good and evil within yourself and within others, and how the consequences of letting one lead more than the other. That being said, what I always said Turgenev, not Turgenev, but I know I was hearing a lot Turgenev, so I'll go with that. If I slip up, it's because I always said Turgenev.
we can go with Turgenev as well.
Potato,
I butcher
potato,
Russian names.
tomato, tomato.
Yeah, I'm terrible with Russian names.
But what I really liked was what I kind of took away is the overreaching theme around balancing progressivism with tradition. And so what Turgenev, he grew up with lots of land and with money, but he was a hunter, and he also worked with the peasants, and more side by side than as a owner. And while he was educated in St. Petersburg and in Germany, which balances in my mind kind of the intellectual. He had the intellectual education, but he also had the human education. And I always think of the balancing, like, I always say I'm city and country. There's no suburban in my life. I love the city and the cosmopolitan benefits, the art, the food, the intellectual conversations. Cities tended to always be the art of the possible. Now, when cities are dying, it shows you how the art of the possible taken too far without without good boundaries
Mhm.
can erode. But for the most part, like the cosmopolitan sensibilities, cities are about, the potential, and urban and the rural areas and country to me is more about the constraints of us as humans within a broader ecosystem and understanding how we relate to a broader ecosystem of, with animals and food. And to me, that's where being human
Mhm.
is truly felt. Like that's where it's quiet so you can hear your thoughts. It's where it's quiet so you can feel the energy of the animals, you can feel the energy of the land, and you learn to work in balance with all of that when you're in the rural. And so what I see the battle, the unraveling today, that was similar to the unraveling that Turgenev was dealing with in Fathers and Sons, is the overreaching of the progressive and intellectual. The nihilism, we don't believe in any tradition.
Mhm.
Everything must be destroyed, because nothing is unless it has value to me.
Mhm.
So the overreaching of like the progressivism with the overreaching of religion as a traditional moral framework.
Mhm.
Where Turgenev landed was, yes, the art of the possible, science matters, art matters, but you balance that with the need to have balance with with land and people and animals. So he gets to the same place that in intellectual understanding and understanding of nature takes you, but he ignores the extremes through his
Mhm.
language. And where we are right now, society wise, we have the wokesters who are break all systems, and then we have the extreme right, religious, that aren't willing to, in neither group is willing to compromise or understand positions of the other. At his time, as you said, like Bazarov is the first Bolshevik. He's the nihilist, woke, progressive Bolshevik. But 50 years later, the Bolsheviks, killed the Tsar and the Romanovs and allowed Lenin to rise. And how many people did Lenin kill? 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 million.
Somewhere in there.
It's all
Yeah.
debatable. Yeah. But, so both extremes. The Tsar was extremely totalitarian. uh, the rise of the Bolsheviks and ultimately communism was also tyrannical and an authoritarian in its own way. So what I loved with Turgenev was it was real. My takeaway,
Mhm.
and perhaps it's projection of my beliefs, is a balance of, I do believe in intellectual understanding of our history, the world, but balancing that with true understanding of the human nature and the world we live in, and coming to balance with nature and ourselves.
So it's interesting. I'm reading this book at an interesting time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Without going into too many personal details publicly. I'm in the process of moving from a place that by an urban conception would be rural anyway
Mm-hmm.
to a more rural conception, right? A more rural place, right? A place that's
Mm-hmm.
even a place that the people who would be considered rural by the urban um, entity that exists next door to us,
Yeah.
the people who live in this entity consider where I'm going to be rural, which is just weird to me, right? And I'm moving my family and I'm buying some land. I'm becoming well, in one sense, I am becoming like Turgenev. We're going to start homesteading. I'm going to be around like goats and steers and chickens and ducks. Now, the framing for this, the context for this, as I'm reading it, is that I was a kid who, like, allergies, pollen activated my asthma when I was a kid. I was allergic to like animals of all kinds. It was just a mess. And so for a lot of the years of my life, I lived in urban areas or suburban areas at best. I don't hike. I would concrete over a tree because it's trying to kill me. Like I look at a tree as trying to kill me. I don't look at it as trying to help me because it's spitting off this crap and then I can't breathe. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
And so the irony, because God is not without a sense of irony, is that I'm probably going to end up my life in a situation closer to Turgenev than Dostoevsky, right? And so I'm reading Turgenev at this stage of my life, and I'm reading what he's talking about. I'm reading about his background, being a hunter and being a part of nature and being, like you said, this more centrist sort of character in Russian literature and Russian history. And I'm also trying to place that, pardon me, I'm going to cough here. I'm also trying to place that, I have a cough button, folks, so that you don't hear it. I'm also placing that in the context of the history that Turgenev lived through during a time of everything being questioned, right? And everything sort of coming apart. Not yet the chaos, which was going to come afterward, because when nihilists like Bazarov start talking, you know there's going to be chaos on the other side of it.
Right.
And the sense you get both from Nikolai and from his brother Pavel is that they know, because they know traditionally, they know that chaos is on the other side of it, but they can't articulate it. And then Arkady, I think the son of Nikolai, stands in much more for Turgenev, where he's sort of, or Turgenev, where he's sort of the character who, and there's always this person during the Unraveling who's kind of going, oh, well, it won't be that bad. It won't be that bad if it unravels. It'll be fine. Like, we'll be able to handle it. And there were a lot of people when I was in high school in the 90s who said that. A lot of people. They're like, oh, the internet. And I'll just pick on the internet for a moment. Oh, the internet. It's unraveling. It'll be fine. Like, it'll be fine. Or, right after September 11th. Oh, it'll be fine. We'll just go take care of it over there in the Middle East. And it'll be, speaking of current events, we'll go take care of it in the Middle East and it'll be fine. Like, what could possibly go wrong? And that level of, this is going to sound hard, but that level of naivete is, I think, why Turgenev is read in high school and not read so much later on in your life. Because you do get, as you get older and you have more experiences, I would say you become more cynical, but you become more cautious, right?
For me, it's more about balancing. It's more about balancing vision with systems.
Right. Okay.
And and specifically what I mean by this is, you have a lot of folks are like, don't worry about abolishing slavery and the chaos on the other side. It will all work itself out. Well, what they didn't work through is what you do with the released slaves so that they can thrive faster instead of having them have to figure it out.
Right.
And just be thrown out of the place where they were getting fed and had roof over their head, and they have no jobs and no homes.
Which is exactly, by the way, the same thing that was said in America about the emancipation of the slaves. But where we solved that problem in America was we just killed 750,000 people. Like, we just did that. We're just like, okay, well, we'll just kill seven. And we almost wiped out an entire generation during that unraveling, because the spirit of vengeance that would have been in the younger generation, the Bazarovs, was instead in the older generation. It was in the Nikolais and the Pavels.
Well, there also isn't a trust that you'll do what you'll say, right? Like, so to help with a transition. So I noticed this in corporate, where you can plan a good go-to-market. You can plan a good announcement of an M&A event or a restructuring where everyone isn't left in chaos wondering what's next. Like, you can have messaging, you can have discussions, you can have benefits plans, you can have a lot set up to reduce the stress and uncertainty of to make that transition easier, but too many individuals have low expectations around what that transition should look like. And it's like, oh, we'll just figure it out. They actually kind of, yeah, we'll just figure it out. So
We'll wing
you
it.
figure it all out in government, you figure it all out in corporate. And this isn't about, and so for me, it's the balance. Bill Maher on Friday was talking about the balance of, liberals are your pedal on the metal and conservatives are on the brake. And I'm like, no, you do, it's not one or the other. It's both, but it's being thoughtful about it. And unfortunately, most people don't want to do the work of being thoughtful, that go slow to go fast. They either see it being a brake or an accelerator. And ultimately you do have unnecessary chaos.
So I think, yes, absolutely. And now, and this is why I said in my open, with fits and starts,
yep,
the centrists are coming back into the conversation. Maybe not necessarily politically, because politics is always downstream from all of this nonsense. It always is at the end of the day. And I think it started, it's interesting that you mentioned Bill Maher. I think it started with Bill Maher, where I was listening to him a few months ago. And normally I'm like, okay, Bill, that's your position. Okay, that's fine. But I think he's reached a point where he's more like Nikolai than Bazarov now.
Mm-hmm.
And he recognizes, and I don't think he knows how to articulate this, as I think a lot of folks who formerly used to be revolutionaries and then the revolution moved on ahead of them to other places they didn't think the revolution was going to go to.
Yeah.
They don't know how to say, oh, no, wait a minute, there were some things worth preserving.
Right.
And I think he's starting to roll around to that, which looks like a centrist position when the revolution is pushing the fringes, right? Exactly. Is pushing to the fringes, right?
Right.
And in the United States, I think that we did have our revolutionary moment in 2020. I do. I think we had our revolutionary moment from like the summer of 2020 all the way through to like January, February of 2021. That was our revolutionary moment. And I've said this before on this podcast, now we're done. And so when you're done with the revolutionary moment, the centrists come back into the fold, or at least they're invited in. Now, are they going to look the same as the centrists that were previously outside, or who were saying it's not that bad during the last unraveling? No. I mean, no one's going to confuse, how can I frame this? No one's going to confuse Marjorie Taylor Greene with Newt Gingrich. Like nobody's going to do that, Nobody's going to confuse Joe Lieberman with like, I don't know. And I know Joe Lieberman just passed away. Yeah. Like it's not going to happen. So the characters are going to be different, but that centrist pullback, I think, is starting to happen.
I agree. But let's go to Turgenev with Fathers and Sons and Arkady in particular. He grew up on the land, then went to the city and got educated and came back. And what he wants to do, his father's not great at managing the farm and it's not doing well. And Arkady wants to introduce some new practices.
Mm-hmm.
With the land, that he learned when he was away at school. So he's bringing a little bit of science, he's bringing a little bit of modernity, but he's not saying, go be dead those farms. It's only the intellect that matters, right? So he's not saying all institutions that existed before need to die because they're not sustainable in their current fashion. Let's bring a bit of modernity, but smart modernity. And he can say that because he actually has worked the land, he's worked with the people, and he's balanced his practical experience with an intellectual experience, that where he learned about science and medicine and things at school.
Mm-hmm.
Same way today, one, revolutions take years, sometimes decades to occur. I think what happened in 2020 was a broad awakening
Okay.
of the fact that our country was being taken over.
Right.
And because it was done in a soft way, and we observed it through digital means, and not loss of our children. We could say that we're losing our children and we're losing our, men and women to the digital space, but we didn't, and suicide and a lot of other things, but we didn't lose them in a physical war like World War I or World War
Right.
II.
Right.
Right. But, many people could see a soft coup happening. That was we were being redirected away from with an insurrection that had no guns and no army
Right.
behind it. Right.
And no army.
Like, so people, like most people, they probably were believing it until, like a few weeks out where the facts started to spew. And then folks were like, wait, what is not making sense here? I had my wake up call in like 2017 with the hysterics day in and day out on the front page of the New York Times, where it's like, doesn't sound like rational analysis of what's occurring. Like, this actually sounds like hysteria. And so then I started just doing deeper dives into news. Like, I would actually watch full videos instead of snapshots. But, whatever, I think 2020 was a pinnacle where it became like we could see the emperor had no clothes.
Right.
But, I've used this term quite a bit. The Leviathan is not going to give up easily.
Right.
And we're going to see a lot more chaos and discomfort through 2024. So it's unraveling. I think the chaos is still here. So what I was challenging was that the revolution happened. I guess my perception is that chaos is still around.
Well, I want to be very clear. I said revolutionary moment. That's not to say that there can't be another moment.
Okay, great.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, another moment. I don't disagree with that. I think things are. When I was a kid, I used to, in my more felonious moments, used to try to knock over Coke machines, right? And one thing I learned about a Coke machine is you got to rock it a few times. You really do. You got to rock it a few times, and then it'll go over. Those things are beasts, right?
Yeah.
You can't just push it once or kick it once or whatever, right? I do think that there are touchstones along the way.
Yeah.
But the high watermark, I genuinely, and I could be wrong. I'm open to being wrong on this, Libby. I absolutely am. I'm open to being corrected on this.
Sure.
But in my heart of hearts, I want to not be wrong.
Right.
I think the high watermark was 2020. That was like the height of BS. That's your high watermark. Everything else after that's going to be step down, step down, step down, step down, step down, step down, until we step down into, the new awakening, and we step down into the new way of moving forward, which, to get back to fathers and sons, may be that combination of, in our time, the Arkadies coming onto the new property and saying, these are the things we could preserve that were old. These are the things we have to inject that are new, and it's fine. Let's move forward with this. It's a vision.
And to bring that to the modern day, I would say the expansion of the Overton window back to normal, a normal size, is why the centrist voices are being heard.
Right.
And people aren't afraid of the retaliation anymore. People are saying what they believe. Like, there was a time when the Overton, I didn't know there was an Overton window. Maybe that I was naive myself, but that Overton window is very broad. You're also seeing a lot of the political talking points that the current administration thinks are going to stick. They're moving through them really fast because they're not working anymore. Which means, kind of the jig is up. and then finally, regulatory lag is also another is an example of politics following culture. You're starting to see a shift on the climate, a lot of the climate policies, because the cost of it was going to be too high, the literal cost of it, and the cost to poor who weren't getting their energy, or their energy costs were going up too high. Like that pushback like started to change, plus people saw that it was the rich getting wealthier and not necessarily, we weren't considering things that were actually going to solve the problem, like nuclear, et cetera.
Right.
So Overton window expansion is the centrist voice is now being able to be heard, and it just starts with a few brave people,
Yeah.
and people seeing they're not killed or die, or commit suicide. And then regulatory lag, you're starting to see a pullback in some of the things that we wouldn't have imagined being able to be pulled back to within reasonable frames, of pursuing. So
Yeah. I like it how you mentioned, and we'll get back to the book here in just a moment, but I like it how you mentioned the Overton window, because I think that, and I mentioned this when the Russians invaded the Ukraine, the Overton window got moved around us having open conversations around the use of nuclear weapons in warfare, which I can't remember that conversation ever being in the public space after like 1994, when people were going on and on about, not going on and on, but when there was a lot of analysis about whether or not nuclear weapons would be used in Bosnia. And I do remember that. And I had literally not heard hide or hair about nukes until the Russians invaded the Ukraine. And now, at an international level, we have the Iranians escalating with the Israelis, which while that has moved the Overton window towards a conversation of what Israel does next, it has not moved it towards a conversation of how soon are the nukes coming to Tel Aviv or Tehran. And it's interesting to me, always in these kinds of discussions, the Overton window is interesting for me for where it moves and then where it does not go. And so I think, and I was one of the folks last year who was saying, we got to stop talking about nuclear war. We just do. We got to stop talking about it. Not to say that by stopping and talking about it, it's not going to happen. I'm saying instead, let's not give that conversation energy. And instead, let's give conversation energy to something else that's more productive. Because if you start giving energy to that conversation, it's going to grow. And then you will wind up in a spot that
they're priming you for it.
Right.
They're priming you to expect it. And the fact that it had been out of the conversation for so long and then bringing it back. Yeah, I'll go cynic. I'll go skeptical on this. It's because all their other fear tactics aren't working anymore. And now we're back to mutual assured destruction.
Yeah. Yep. No, yeah. So there's a lot of different things a lot of different threads that run underneath this book that parallel our time.
It was brilliant call to read this book, actually.
Yeah. So back to the book.
Although all of the classics seem to parallel this time in some way. Just interesting how that works, isn't it?
As Tom Libby, my other guest co-host, says, the more things change, we all know how that ends. And he's exactly right. All right, so back to the book, back to Fathers and Sons, or Fathers and Children, as it was written in the original Russian by Ivan Turgenev. All right, so we're going to pick up here in chapter 6, and I want to turn this conversation towards something around communication, towards the ideas of communication, particularly communication at the end of where we are at the end of the Enlightenment experience. So Pavel Petrovich is Nikolai's brother, and Without going into a whole lot of background about Pavel, let's just say he's a little more aristocratic than even his brother, if that's at all possible. And he's questioning Bazarov's life choices here. Is your special study physics? Pavel Petrovich, in his turn, inquired. Physics, yes, and natural sciences in general. They say the Teutons of late have had great success in that line. By the way, pause. Teutons means German. Back to the book. Yes, the Germans are our teachers in it, Bazarov answered carelessly. The word Teutons instead of Germans, Pavel Petrovich had used with ironical intention. None noticed it, however. Have you such a high opinion of the Germans? Said Pavel Petrovich with exaggerated courtesy. He was beginning to feel a secret irritation. His aristocratic nature was revolted by Bazarov's absolute the surgeon's son was not only not overawed, he even gave abrupt and indifferent answers, and in the tone of his voice there was something churlish, almost insolent. The scientific men there are a clever lot. To be sure, of Russian scientific men you have not such a flattering opinion, I dare say. That is very likely. That's very praiseworthy self-abnegation, Pavel Petrovich declared, drawing himself up and throwing his head back. But how is this? Arkady Nikolaich was telling me just now that you accept no authorities. Don't you believe in them? And how am I accepting them? And what am I to believe in? They tell me the truth. I agree. That's all. And do all Germans tell the truth? Said Pavel Petrovich, and his face assumed an expression as unsympathetic as remote, as if he had withdrawn to some cloudy height. Not all, replied Bazarov with a short yawn. He obviously did not care to continue the discussion. Pavel Petrovich glanced at Arkady, and as though he would say to him, your friend's polite, I must say. For my own part, he began again, not without some effort. I am so unregenerate as not to like Germans. Russian Germans I am not speaking of now. We all know what sort of creatures they are, but even German Germans are not to my liking. In former days, there were some here and there. They had, well, Schiller, to be sure, Goethe, my brother, he takes a particularly favorable view of them. But now they have all turned chemists and materialists. A good chemist is 20 times as useful as any poet, broke in Bazarov. Oh, indeed, commented Pavel Petrovich as though falling asleep. He faintly raised his eyebrows. You don't acknowledge art then, I suppose. The art of making money or of advertising pills, cried Bazarov with a contemptuous laugh. You are pleased to jest, I see. You reject all that, no doubt. Granted. Then you believe in science only. I have already explained to you that I don't believe in anything. And what is science? Science of the abstract? There are sciences, as there are trades and crafts, but abstract science doesn't exist at all. Very good. Well, and in regard to the other traditions accepted in human conduct, you maintain the same negative attitude? What's this, an examination? Asked Bazarov. Pavel Petrovich turned slightly pale. Nikolai Petrovich thought it his duty to interpose in the conversation. We will converse on this subject with you more in detail some day, dear Yevgeny Vasilievich. We will hear your views and express our own. For my part, I am heartily glad you are studying the natural sciences. I have heard that Liebig has made some wonderful discoveries in the amelioration of soils. You can be of assistance to me in my agricultural labors. You can give me some useful advice. I am at your service, Nikolai Petrovich, but Liebig's miles over our heads. One has to first learn the ABC and then begin to read, and we haven't set our eyes on the alphabet yet. You are certainly a nihilist. I see that, thought Nikolai Petrovich. Still, you will allow me to apply to you on occasion, he added aloud. And now I fancy, brother, it's time for us to be going to have a talk with the bailiff. Pavel Petrovich got up from his seat. Yes, he said, without looking at anyone. It's a misfortune to live 5 years in a country like this, far from mighty intellects. You turn into a fool directly. You may try not to forget what you've been taught, but in a snap, they'll prove all that's rubbish and tell you that sensible men have nothing more to do with such foolishness, and that you, if you please, are an antiquated old fogey. What's to be done? Young people, of course, are cleverer than we are. Pavel Petrovich turned slowly on his heels and slowly walked away. Nikolai Petrovich went after him. Is he always like that? Bazarov coolly inquired of Arkady directly. The door had closed behind the two brothers. I must say, Yevgeny, you weren't very nice to him, remarked Arkady. You have hurt his feelings. Well, am I going to consider them these provincial aristocrats? Why, it's all vanity, dandy habits, fatuity. He should have continued his career in Petersburg if that's his bent. But there, enough of him. I found a rather rare species of water beetle, Disticus margariatus. Do you know? I will show it to you. I promised to tell you his story, began Arkady. The story of the beetle? Come, don't Yevgeny. The story of my uncle. You will see he's not the sort of man you fancy. He deserves pity rather than ridicule. Oh, I don't dispute it, but why are you worrying over him? One ought to be just, Yevgeny. How does that follow? No, listen. And Arkady told him his uncle's story. The reader will find it in the following chapter. That exchange right there between Pavel Petrovich and Eugene Bazarov, with Arkady and Nikolai watching from the sidelines, is the beginning of Turgenev wrestling with new ideas versus old traditions. But it's also the beginning of Turgenev setting the table around a critical core idea in his book, in Fathers and Sons, and it is this core idea of communication between generations. So let's start with this idea of nihilism, because how we think of nihilism almost 100 and what is it? It's almost 170 years after the events in Fathers and Sons has transformed from what Turgenev might have initially been proposing. So nihilism at the time, in the 1850s and in the 1860s, was a new theory of the world that had sprung up from the mind of German intellectuals like Hegel, he of the Hegelian dialectic, and Nietzsche, he of the man and Superman. Russian nihilism was defined at the time as, quote, the symbol of struggle against all forms of tyranny, hypocrisy, and artificiality, and for individual freedom. So nihilism was perceived as a way to tear down the systems of tyranny, the czarist systems of tyranny, quite frankly, that were impacting every single piece of Russian culture, all the way from the interactions between people of different classes, the upper class, the middle class, and the worker, well, not even the worker, the peasant and the serf class, all the way to how all of those classes engaged with the czar and the czarist's apparatchiks and the bureaucracy surrounding the czar. Now, Russian nihilists of the late 19th century, just like Bazarov, rejected political violence. And he actually says that in the book. He rejects taking on murder or riotous nature or thievery. And they rejected political violence or violence with a political focus as a quote unquote outdated stage of humanity. They kind of remind me in that way of the new atheists of the early 20th century, the early 21st century in the United States. Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and my friend over there, Sam, and I'll remember his name in a second here, Harris. That's right, my buddy Sam Harris, who, by the way, all three of those guys, not Hitchens, but Dawkins and Harris, have over the course of time come around to the idea that atheist nihilism might not get you where you need to go in the West. The Russian nihilists would eventually have their ideals hijacked by the Trotskyites during the Bolshevik Revolution. The Trotskyites were, in that revolution, centrists, centrist Bolsheviks, while Lenin was an extreme Bolshevik. And so that was sort of the makeup of that coalition that was engaged in political violence. And Trotsky was more than happy to send his enemies to a gulag or send them to be shot in a mass execution. And so, and he was more than willing to do this, all the while claiming that he believed that he was in a struggle against all forms of tyranny, hypocrisy, artificiality, and in a struggle for political and individual freedom. But Bazarov doesn't see any of this yet. Bazarov's 20. By the time the Russian Revolution shows up and is completed, if Bazarov makes it, which he won't, but guys like him never do. But Bazarov will be in his 60s or 70s. He'll be a traditionalist by the time the Bolshevik Revolution shows up. But there's a deeper idea here in this chapter, and it is this idea of how do generations communicate? And how do generations communicate when the younger generation is disillusioned with the older generation, disillusioned with false promises, disillusioned with unfulfilled potential, judging the past based on the perfection of the present? So here's a question for you, Libby. Let's start with this. For leaders who are listening to this, leaders across all spectrums, how can genuine communication occur across generations in spite of such disillusionment? And I do think this is a core question for our time, particularly in the United States, as we have 4 generations in the workplace right now. We have baby boomers, we have Gen Xers, we have millennials, and we have Gen Zers. And we've always had 4 generations in the workplace, and there's always been issues with communication and disillusionment. But I think those issues become sharper with social media and the speed with which trends move through our society and culture, particularly communication trends. So how do we communicate successfully?
Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
It is a good question, because as you noted, their voice been in multiple generations, in the workplace together and in civilization together. What's changed is the speed of communication, but more importantly, the shift in focus and direction, specifically that the younger generations can take. Like it's hard to focus them. Their belief, they're not aware that their belief structure is constantly changing and in flux. But I think now.
And this was a tough one. Well, this was a tough one because, like, if we look back at history, in the United States, the generation that came up with the whole idea of never trust anyone over 30 is the current generation that can't retire.
They're also saying, get over it, trust us,
Right.
So if you understand human nature, all you're seeing is that, no one wants to be out of power. So when you're feeling powerless, you're fighting against the power. When you have power, you want to stay in power. And I think there's more righteousness on one side than the other. One is more, stay off, stay off my back. I'll stay off you. Don't tread on me. And the other is like, do as I say, not as I do, because I know better. And so we throughout history and, in society, in general, you have the nanny state and you have the don't mess with me state. And it's a constant, movement of one going from the bottom to the top. And when you're in the top, especially those who love the power don't want to relinquish it, and ration and reason don't always work. But where I was going to go is knowing that these trends and cycles are constant, recognizing again human nature. We are designed to repel those telling us about to act certain ways. That's why you have youth questioning their parents. When you learn something new for the first time and you're new at learning things for the first time, you think everything that you learn for the first time is the truth and new and absolute. And anyone who doesn't think the same way as you, is just not as enlightened. But once you get more experience and you realize that the less the more you know, the less you know, you're a bit more accommodating of others as they're moving through that natural life cycle of like learning and growing, experiencing life, idealism into reality. You are intended to, like, you're designed to be idealistic when you're young. Everything is new. You think everything we're designed to go through those cycles, and experience is what actually informs us of reality. And so from my perspective, I was a brash know-it-all, especially in my late teens and through my 20s, and I cringe now at some of the things that I said to my elders who were incredibly smart and accomplished. And now I look at myself, I look at myself from their perspective, and they knew who I was and that I was just going through a stage. They never got emotional about it. They were rational, indulged. They they use the Socratic method. They provide different examples to plant seeds for me as a youth of different ways to think. But I think the wrong way of having multi-generations think is telling people that they're wrong or they're stupid, and it's my way or the highway. And it doesn't matter if you're an elder or a youth. So as most leaders that inspire, they inspire because you don't feel judged. They inspire you because you feel heard. Even if they don't necessarily agree with you, you feel heard and that you matter. And so from where I sit, it's continuing to be, strong in your principles and convictions, but as a leader, knowing that there are maybe things that you don't know and having an open mind, but also not judging others for things that are different than what you believe in and that you actually know to be true. The challenge we have is creating, can't believe I'm going to say this, a safe space for actual work. And what I mean by that is you just want to work. Like, I just want to make great products. I just want to work with a team where we're focused on get GSD and helping each other to be successful. I don't care about your politics. I don't care about who you're married to and what you're doing in your bedroom. I don't care if you have a tattoo or not. I don't care who you're voting for. Like, for me, what matters is who you are in the room. And are you focused on getting the work done that you committed to? Are you able to support a team member who may need support? You know, but helping each other to thrive around the work we're doing and keeping the noise out of the system. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't care about individuals as humans. I do, but religion, community service, politics is for outside of work, and we can discuss that outside of work, or we create specific times and forums for in work where that's all that you're talking about. But just like they did at Coinbase, just like they're doing at a lot of other Palantir companies that you want to work for, even Twitter and X, like the companies I want to work for are the ones that are passionate about the product, and the people is the culture and the teamwork to get the product done.
So let me ask you a question here, because this is an idea that some companies have gone all in on, but the vast majority of publicly traded companies still seem to be really focused on all of this other stuff that's hooked into workplace culture, but actually erodes culture. And they don't seem to be as hooked into the product. So case in point, I get a lot of, one of the parts of our business, we do a lot of my consultancy. We do a lot of bidding on corporate gigs, right? So we'll bid for a gig, right? And I can actually glance over to my email and see this in my email now. I've got a bid that was emailed to me. I'm not going to bid on this, but it was emailed to me by a corporate client with a name that you would know if I said it. And they are bidding out diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging training. Now, again, I'm not going to go into sort of the benefits of DEI or the drawbacks or any of that. I'm clear on the record on all of that, my thoughts on all that. You're a publicly traded company and you're bidding out this project. Now, on the one hand, you could say at Libby, as you've already stated, maybe they're just bidding this out for one specific time, for one specific area that's in work, and that it won't impact the rest of everything else because they'll be ridiculously focused on the product. But this company hasn't been ridiculously focused on its product for a while. Again, if I said the name of the company, you would know who they are. They haven't been focused on their stuff for a while. And so I look at all of these sort of, I call them side games, right? That corporations are doing.
Yeah.
And the side games get a lot of fire and smoke and attention in a cycle, a media cycle. But all they do is create distractions for the people that just want to, like you said, GSD and show up and do the work. And
they're not focused on actual value creation for their customer.
Right.
They're focused on metrics that matter to a broader stakeholder group. And quite honestly, excellence is the exception. It's not the rule. Publicly traded companies, especially those, with 50,000 employees, 100,000, 250,000, they're attracting the average and the mediocre. And so what are the things that they think are going to attract the average and the mediocre? These aren't people, as a rule of thumb, who are looking for careers to thrive and grow, to contribute, value and get value in return. For the most part, these are people who just want a job. Show up, they basically work to live and they don't live to work. So when your company isn't valued based on the value you deliver to your customer, the value you deliver to your partners and your employees, or it has to appeal to the masses, you're going to get mass programs and mass communications. And so this is why you're seeing a continuation of all those things that on the surface feel good, but you and I both know are candy for, are empty calories for the company. Yeah,
Right.
I always said like HR for the most part is a make work function.
Yeah.
You know, there are key elements of it that learning and development, and there are things that I think are important, but I don't think you have to have them in-house. They are
Right.
functions that I think you build the capability, you deliver it, it's embedded in the culture, and you move on. But when you have a full-time function that that isn't actively and directly creating value for your customer or your partners, you have a make work function. So
Okay, so let me ask you this question then. How much
but
of a
but not in a nutshell, it's
Mhm.
because they're appealing to the masses. They're not trying to be exceptional.
Okay,
They don't
so
need to be exceptional. They have cash flow that, like, why do you think the cable companies haven't shifted in
oh
in
Lord,
25
yeah,
years?
yeah.
Right?
No, you're
Because
right.
they
Yeah.
don't have to. They're
Okay,
appealing
so
to the masses.
I asked this question on LinkedIn. Well, I didn't ask it. I sort of did a rant on LinkedIn, and I got in a whole bunch of trouble with people. It's fine. I'm used to getting in trouble. And my rant basically came down to this: bring back the cantankerous, disagreeable, I'm going to tell you what to do, the right way to do it because I'm competent, but I'm probably not going to tell you in a way that's going to make you feel good leader. Like, bring that, and it is going to be a guy, sorry ladies, but bring that guy back, because that guy will make sure doors don't fall off the planes of your product in midair.
There are many women like that too.
There are many women like that.
Yeah.
Bring back the kind of leader who will get the bridge in Baltimore up faster than 10 years, because it shouldn't take 10 years. Like, you just need one person who's willing to be disagreeable and just yell at everybody and tell them to do it right, and that we're going to be here 25 years until you do it right, or we could be here 10 minutes. Do it right.
Yeah, I don't know
and,
that
and
to me,
the
it's
reason why
not
I'm
about
framing,
being disagreeable, but it's not compromising on the things that matter.
okay, well, not compromising these days seems like being
Well,
disagreeable.
that's because people, yeah.
Yeah, because we're in this make work, because, and I'm drawing
We're
this parallel.
in this make work feel good.
Space.
Give me a
Yeah.
dopamine hit world.
Right.
And I can also say that these startups are also appealing to the average, because these startups are funded by VCs. They have no accountability other than exiting. And when there's a ton of money chasing non-economic entities, they can do a lot of stupid stuff that doesn't actually deliver any value. So the reason you're seeing this stuff continue is because there's no accountability. Either like the businesses are going to continue to be going concerns because they're either funded by legacy cash flows and brand, or by VCs that are funding them, and they don't actually have to produce positive cash flow. The only reason you can produce positive cash flow is because you actually have products that people love, partnerships that people value, and employees committed to your company.
But are we to a point where we have to be? Are we to a point where the only way out? We were just talking about this before we started. The only way out is through, and the way to get through sort of the mediocrity and the lack of focus on product and the lack of accountability. The only way through, and I'm asking this as a challenge question to you, because I don't know what the answer is myself, but I know what I want the answer to be based on my temperament. So, but that's not true, right? It's just based on my temperament, right? Like, is the only way through to find that unlikable person, man or woman, I don't care. Find that unlikable person and give them the stamp, or do we need to find a way? Is there a third way? To paraphrase from Bill Clinton, is there?
But likability is like overrated. Like, I like, likability isn't what you need to run a business. It might be nice to be liked, but there's a difference between being respected and being hated or disliked. Disliked, to me, respected is, I'm telling you what our decision criteria is. I'm telling you where we're heading. I'm telling you why we're not investing in these functions. And I'm giving you kind of likability is emotional driven. Respect is rationally driven. We need more rational leaders who can share things from a rational basis. And right now you just have too many, like, apologizing because someone's feelings are hurt. Well, I'm sorry, you interpreted it something differently than I intended it, but you need to take accountability for what you're feeling. I'm going to check my intentions, but my intentions, I know my intentions. I'm not going to apologize for how you receive them because you have had a different experience that interprets my actions one way that was not actually real. So the only way through, yes, is just like Elon did. I'm sorry, Elon did it. He didn't apologize. He fired 80% of the staff because the staff was noise. They weren't actually creating value. When you focus on what you need, you just need to build and deliver an amazing experience. Look at the innovation that's happened at X in the last year. It's insane. Look at the innovation that happened at Zoom in the last year. Zero.
Right.
One company is focused on being liked and probably has 20,000 employees that are talking about politics or, lots of other stuff we don't care about during the workday. And the other one is trying to get us done.
So the
right?
biggest example right now of what you're talking about is Google. I mean, just
I
look
know,
at the
right?
right.
Yeah.
Like that's
I
the
was
biggest example
thinking
right
about
now.
it today.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like Google Gemini and that entire disastrous rollout and all that. Okay. So my follow-up question to that is this. Because I don't know what the answer is. This is why I'm asking.
Right.
Will younger generations who have been communicated with differently and by the way, have different expectations of communication, still follow that sort of leader, or not even follow, will listen and be appreciative of the communication style of someone for whom likability is on number 10 of their list of the top 10 things they have to be. And effectiveness is number 1 or maybe number 2, whatever's number 1, number 2. It's not likability. Are younger generations, because this is the challenge question for all of us out here, not just publicly traded, but small, medium-sized businesses all the way up and down, because the cancer is everywhere. I have conversations with folks all the time. The cancer is everywhere, okay? In all of our business sectors, all of our economic sectors. It's even in our families. I mean, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah, it is.
And so will younger generations follow that person if that person sets those expectations correctly, or will they rebel?
From where I say it, the exception, if you're looking for excellence, if you're looking for working in in an empowered way, if you're focused on in a challenging experience that you get excited about, you are going to work for that effective leader and not just the nice leader. We have all worked with nice leaders. Be like, I'm gonna quit. I don't care how nice you are if you're actually not removing the barriers to my success.
Mm-hmm.
Like, at the end of the day, I'm at work. I don't want to have to jump over, 30 bad processes and redundant work and people not doing their job because you're not doing your job as a leader. I don't care how nice you are. You might be the nicest thing on the planet, but if you're not helping me to be effective in my role, I'm moving on to the next role and the next leader. So I always talk about this outside in kind of transformation. Google is lost, 200,000 employees, one of the largest publicly traded companies around, and all they do is search. What was the last innovation that they did that you were excited about? Zero. They're only about search and then talking in their Slack channels about politics and gender ideology. That's an example of where cash flow is allowing them to not be accountable to their shareholders for new innovation and great ideas. But do you need to be loud and vocal, or do you just set the example and attract attract bees to honey? You can find that there's lots of incredible talent who actually wants to have their potential unleashed, who doesn't want to talk about BS, that actually wants to do great things. They just haven't seen it. Just show it to them, and they'll start talking to others, and others will want to be a part of your organization. I actually would love to do more research on Coinbase to see what's happening there. I'd like to do more around Palantir, and then what Lucky Homer's company is. Like, I'd really like to see what they're getting with respect to employee feedback, and employee engagement, because those are companies where you have strong leaders who also have strong teams working within their businesses. I want to see how satisfied those employees are, because those guys are going to be the examples, at least Palantir and Coinbase, around trying to live by your principles and focusing on delivering great product. The same would be for Twitter, and not Glassdoor, pre-Elon, but maybe the last 6 months, where you have engineers who are actually able to deliver and continue to deliver new features and functionality. So the only way is through. I think the biggest risk that we run, though, is that the momentum from the great is not good enough to offset the cancer that is everywhere.
Okay. Back to the book. We're rounding it. We got to round our corner here. We've taken a lot of Libby's time. We got to round the corner here. We got to wrap this sucker up. We got to bring this home. So let's get back to the book. Back to Fathers and Sons. By the way, you can pick up Turgenev. It is an open source book now. So it's published in a wide variety of different formats. You can get it online as well, from any major or minor publisher. So I'd encourage you to go out and pick up a copy of Fathers and Sons. Back to the book. We're going to pick up in chapter 8 with Nikolai Petrovich's new mistress, Fenichka. Nikolai Petrovich had made Fenichka's acquaintance in the following manner. He had once happened 3 years before to stay a night at an inn in a remote district town. He was agreeably struck by the cleanliness of the room assigned to him, the freshness of the bed linen. Surely the woman of the house must be a German, was the idea that occurred to him, but she proved to be a Russian, a woman of about 50, neatly dressed, of a good-looking, sensible countenance and discreet speech. He entered into conversation with her at tea. He liked her very much. Nikolai Petrovich had, at the time, only just moved into his new home, and not wishing to keep serfs in the house, he was on the lookout for wage servants. The woman of the inn, on her side, complained of the small number of visitors to the town and the hard times. He proposed to her to come into his house in the capacity of a housekeeper. She consented. Her husband had long been dead, leaving her an only daughter, Fenichka. Within a fortnight, Arina Savishna, that was the new housekeeper's name, arrived with her daughter at Merino and installed herself in the little lodge. Nikolai Petrovich's choice proved a successful one. Arina brought order to the household. As for Fenichka, who was at that time 17, no one spoke of her and scarcely anyone saw her. She lived quietly and sedately, and only on Sundays Nikolai Petrovich noticed in the church, somewhere in a side place, the delicate profile of her white face. More than a year passed thus. One morning, Arina came into his study, and bowing low as usual, she asked him if he could do anything for her daughter, who had got a spark from the stove in her eye. Nikolai Petrovich, like all stay-at-home people, had studied doctoring and even compiled a homeopathic guide. He at once told Arina to bring the patient to him. Fenichka was much frightened when she heard the master had sent for her. However, she followed her mother. Nikolai Petrovich led her to the window and took her head in his 2 hands. After thoroughly examining her red and swollen eye, he prescribed a fomentation, which he made up himself at once, and tearing his handkerchief to pieces, he showed her how it ought to be applied. Fenichka listened to all he had to say and then was going. Kiss the master's hand, silly girl, said Arina. And Nikolai Petrovich did not give her his hand, and in confusion himself kissed her bent head on the parting of her hair. Fenichka's eye was soon well again, but the impression she had made on Nikolai Petrovich did not pass away so quickly. He was forever haunted by that pure, delicate, timidly raised face. He felt on the palms of his hands that soft hair and saw those innocent, slightly parted lips through which pearly teeth gleamed with moist brilliance in the sunshine. He began to watch her with great attention in church and tried to get into conversation with her. At first, she was shy of him, and one day, meeting him at the approach of evening in a narrow footpath through a field of rye, she ran into the tall, thick rye, overgrown with cornflowers and wormwood, so as not to meet him face to face. He caught sight of her little head through a golden network of ears of rye, for which she was peeping out like a small little animal, and called affectionately to her, "Good evening, Fenichka. I don't bite." "Good evening," she whispered, not coming out of her ambush. By degrees, she began to be more at home with him, but was still shy in his presence. When suddenly her mother, Irina, died of cholera, what was to become of Fenichka? She inherited from her mother a love for order, regularity, and respectability. But she was so young, so alone. Nikolai Petrovich was himself so good and considerate. It's needless to relate the rest. This is one of those moments in a book, in a Russian novel, and Russian novelists in general have this little twitch that they do, where Dostoevsky did it, Tolstoy did it. I mean, it's all of what War and Peace is about. My gosh, and Turgenev, even Nabokov. We're reading. We're trying to get through and read Lolita, and trying to pull some interesting things from Lolita. That's a fascinating little book there. But every single one of these Russian writers is consumed with the idea of how relationships develop between men and women. In particular, how relationships develop between men and women of different social classes and across different ages. Now, it's interesting. As I was reading this book, I also the other day watched a television show from the 1970s where this older man was having an affair with his younger secretary, and my 13-year-old daughter, getting ready to be 14, happened to be in the room, and we were watching the show, and she was like, and it's the 1970s, it's the Rockford Files, actually. And my daughter goes, "Ew, he's so old." It's like, yeah, well, you're 14. That's the correct response. Thank you. You're right. You're exactly right. He is so old. But I said they're only separated by, like, this is the 70s. They're only separated by like 20 years. It's fine. She's in her 20s. He's in his 50s or 30s or whatever, 40s. It's fine. And she still looked at me. She gave me the side look with the sneer that only a 14-year-old girl can give her father. It's fine. It's whatever. But it puts me in mind of what I was just reading there in this book. And Nikolai is attempting to be a moral man in a culture where the morality of connection and of interpersonal sexual behavior between people of different classes and between people of different ages is strictly bounded. And one of the interesting things about Fenichka is when Arkady, who is closer to Fenichka's age, and Nikolai's son, when Arkady and Bazarov return to the property, Fenichka has a little baby boy. And of course, because it's Russian, everyone's very discreet about such things, but everybody knows what is happening. This, of course, creates tension between Arkady and Bazarov. And Arkady basically says, my father has a right to be happy. And Bazarov also says that your father has a right to be happy, but they're coming from different perspectives on this. Bazarov is coming from a nihilistic perspective. Arkady is coming from a perspective that's way more personal, way more individualized to what he knows about his father. The challenge that Turgenev presents to us in this part of Fathers and Sons and further on in the book is the challenge of whether or not such morality should impact state policy. Do we really need to, and by the way, we've done this in our own country. We've scaled up in people's individualized experiences to the level of state policy. That is currently what is happening with the transgender contra Trump. And I don't call it a movement. I call it a contra Trump. We're taking people's individual experience and we're scaling it largely to a collective, interestingly enough, involving children. And in an attempt to, as we did in the 1950s and 1960s in America, to enfranchise those on the fringes, we moved the edges closer to the center. But what we didn't realize was that the fringe that's way out there now becomes closer to the center. This happens in cross-generational transitions, and this occurs, or this is a danger that can occur. And I think this is what Arkady is really focused on, not Pavel, not Bazarov. I think he senses it, but doesn't know how to say it in the book. The danger of scaling the individual experience to the collective is that you will lose the morality that the collective has relied upon all of this time. And of course, Bazarov doesn't see it as being a problem. We've talked about cross-generational wisdom a little bit on some of this, Libby. Maybe just some brief comments on how we practically kind of get through this moment. And I think it's different in America because it's a moment by moment sort of thing with us, as I think it is in all countries. I do think that because the messaging and the speed of the messaging has increased, we don't have time. We don't have 5 years to think about something now. We don't have 2 years to think about something now. Now we have to make a decision, a split-second decision about someone doing something on TikTok in about 10 seconds before we can like scroll to the next thing, right? We're not being given time to think. I think that's on purpose. But putting that aside, how do we transition that wisdom that Arkady knows he has, but doesn't know how to articulate? And I think a lot of people know they have it. They do. But they don't know how to get that across to people who are trying to scale up their individualized experience to collective state policy.
It's a question is as old as time, right?
It is a question as old as time. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, forget it. We covered this in the Republic of Plato. So yes, it's as old as time. Yeah.
Yeah. More things change, the more they stay the same. I really like the Socratic method around this. And specifically, I'm trying to remember this author's name. I can't think of it. Can't think of her name right now. She's kind of in the woo-woo space. But she asks, she has 4 core questions that she asks when she has a response, positive or negative towards something she's seen or observing. And it's like, questions like, how do I know this to be true? Why do I believe this to be true? What would the world look like if it wasn't true? So it recognizes that our belief systems are based on our experience overlaid by, thoughts and narratives from others, and that reality, our belief structure system, is actually relative to only our experience. So if we start to actually ask why we believe something and why we might be hesitant to not believe something different, because who would I be if I believe something different? My tribe might not like me anymore, or I might have to re-examine so much more about the world if what I believed is no longer true. So framing by asking the youth the things they know, and in those 4 questions, can help them. It just creates a thought process and plants seeds for them to question what they know and to maybe be more open as they experience life or take in information, to maybe think differently. So what we see as a natural progression already from young to old, for the most part, is they go from idealists to pragmatists, and hopefully don't lose their lust for life and become cynical in that process, but actually enjoy life more as they become practical and and see how much more they have to learn. I think if we just open someone's aperture, like allow that movement into maturity so much faster. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it sort of answers the question as we sort of round the corner here, where do we go from here? Right. Like opening that aperture of experience, opening that back in the 60s, they called it the age of Aquarius, right? We're going to have a new consciousness raising, right? A new understanding. No one's talking about language. No one's talking in language like that now. Matter of fact, the recent solar eclipse that we had in North America, I told my 7-year-old that his third eye was going to open, and he was running around telling other people that. And my wife is like, "You probably need to stop talking to him." Yeah. Well, I do some things to amuse myself with my children. Anyway, but my point is that opening of the aperture, that understanding, right? I think it has to operate on so many different levels that it befuddles us. And so I think at certain points in times, particularly in American culture, we can only focus on one level at once. Like right now, we're hyper focused on the technological level. We think that if we just open up our aperture around all these technologies, then enlightenment, for want of a better word, will appear. But there's always a poverty that's attached to that, right? Because the enlightenment has to happen in a bunch of different places. You can't just have your perceptions expanded in one spot. That's too narrow. You've got to have your perceptions expanded in your communication, in your finances, in your spirituality, in your technology. Like it's all, because all these things come together in who you are, right, as a leader, but also who you are as a follower.
Well, I think that the one thing I do know for sure is that telling people that there's only one way, or my way, is the fastest path to people shutting down.
Correct.
So people will change when they're ready to change. And first is helping. We talk about the change curve a lot in transformation, and enterprise transformation, but it's also in personal transformation. Is like, first you have an awareness of something, and then you maybe seek deeper understanding of it, and then you have knowledge, and then you have mastery. But what our goal is to just help build awareness. And you can help build awareness through questioning and maybe sharing, ideas and sources. But by telling people that they don't know what's in their best interest and better, you'll shut people down to discovery. You also shut yourself down to discovery, because the other thing that I know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure.
Well, that's where leadership.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, this is a leadership podcast. So we covered a lot of different areas today. And thank you for listening. And leadership takes all of that you've talked about and then transmits that, because that's all called wisdom, transmits that through coaching, through communication, through mentoring, through creating succession plans. And here's another way: actually leaving when you say you're going to leave.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Do what you say.
Do what you say you're going to do. And these are areas that we struggle with, but I'm starting to see people saying things like the future is bright, or I have optimism. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at some of the same things that you and I are looking at, and they're drawing different conclusions. But I think that wisdom transfer, that I don't know what I don't know, is probably the humility that needs to be at the core of all leadership communication cross-generationally.
I would agree. And that's where the power of story comes in too, is how did you get, share my experience of how I got to believe the thing that I believe currently. And also share that if in 10 years from now, I'm not questioning everything I believe now, then I haven't learned and grown.
Right.
But by sharing the journey, you can share with people the thought processes and experiences that at some point they may be able to mirror or relate to, that can help them like, with their own journey. But it gives like treat people as adults.
Yeah.
To provide kind of reasons to support why you believe what you believe. Help, like for me, it's also about being, it's about coaching, but it's like showing as well. So I don't ask anyone to do what I won't do myself. And I'll sit side by side with folks to help them, to learn or understand something. But I want to go back to the other conversation about agreeableness and disagreeableness.
Oh, yeah.
I think the most important thing is about it just strengthening your adherence to your principles and not compromising on your principles. So, from a leadership perspective, the how I may not care as much about the principles, have a how element to it, but not compromising on quality.
Right.
So outcomes, right? And I do care about how we get to those outcomes, right? Like I don't want a person with poor values who's walking all over the team, getting to the to like a tangible outcome. So I have principles about how we work together, holding each other accountable, integrity, collaboration. I also have principles around quality standards and not lowering them because they're hard, like figure out like that the challenge and the excitement is around actually achieving hard goals and objectives. But giving people space to actually use their own brain and to create to get there. So, leadership is about balancing the principles with the how, and people, there's a lack of soul and excitement when you're told how to do everything. If you understand where you're going and the why, and you're given some constraints around the how, but they're only not so much that you can't express any of your creativity or use any of your brain. The whole goal is to allow people to feel empowered, allow people to create, but not giving them so much rope that they can hang themselves and or provide, create risk for the company. So the disagreeableness is only around radical candor. It's only about questioning, but not holding, but not giving up on your principles. And too many leaders we've seen have given up on their principles in order to stay in power, in order to be liked. And when you do that, you're losing your soul. But effectively, to be a good leader, it's the power of the question. It's the power of the question. It's the power of the story. And it's belief in the individual to be able to, take on big challenges and succeed.
I think Turgenev would, or Turgenev would agree. So I would encourage you to pick up a copy of Fathers and Sons, take a look at it, mark it up, read it, contextualize it for our time now. I'd like to thank Libby Unger for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And with that, we're out.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.